Welcome. It is my pleasure to introduce today's webinar, The Rise of U.S. Child Labor and How We Can Fight Back. And I first want to extend a warm welcome to everyone who's attending on behalf of the Economic Policy Institute and the Economic Analysis and Research Network, otherwise known as EARN, which is EPI's nationwide network of research, policy, and advocacy organizations fighting at the state and local level for an economy that works for everyone. My name is Jennifer Shearer. I'm director of our State Worker Power Initiative at EPI, and part of the team at EPI that supports the work of our state EARN network groups and their partners. And I want to thank our communications team for helping prepare for today's webinar, and my colleague Daniel Perez, who's sharing some links both to our EPI and EARN websites and how to follow along with us on social media. The topic of today's webinar has been central to our work at EPI and EARN over the past year. My EPI colleague, Nina Mast, is co-hosting today's webinar with me, and we want to express how grateful and excited we are to have with us three incredibly expert guest speakers, David Weil, Norma Flores-Lopez, and Terry Gerstein. We will more fully introduce each of them when we turn to their presentations in just a few minutes. Today's webinar is an opportunity for us to take stock of what we know to be a growing crisis and to also discuss opportunities for effective collective responses. So we will be considering why exploitative forms of child labor are on the rise and the industries and interest groups behind what appears to be a very ongoing coordinated push to weaken child labor standards. We will discuss how efforts to eliminate child labor standards are also intertwined with a larger policy agenda focused on boosting corporate profits, expanding access to pools of low-wage labor, and in many states, diminishing access to public education and social safety net programs for some children and their families, threatening as a result to deepen already extreme economic and racial inequalities. And we are excited to have panelists with us who will help draw attention to proactive, systemic solutions that policymakers and advocates can pursue to prevent hazardous and harmful forms of child labor and empower young workers. So I want to start with a very quick reminder that we are seeing a troubling trend across the country of cases where employers are violating existing child labor laws in the US. The most recent US Department of Labor data on child labor violations showed nearly 6,000 minors employed in violation of child labor laws in fiscal year 2023, which marks an 88% increase in the past 5 years. We know that enforcement agency data and media reports really provide just a glimpse of a larger problem because many violations are never reported or investigated. Some of the cases behind these numbers involve ruthless employers who are recruiting and hiring vulnerable migrant youth for low-wage jobs in factories, meatpacking plants, poultry processing plants, or on hazardous construction sites. We've seen in the past year major and very important investigative journalism reports that have documented the hazardous conditions and long hours that children in some cases are working in some of these jobs, including overnight shifts that interfere with school attendance and lead to injuries. Other violations behind those numbers represent the most common form of child labor violation. Fast food restaurants and other low-wage service industry employers scheduling children to work for hours that are far beyond established guidelines intended to ensure adequate time for education and healthy development for children who are working while still in junior high or high school. We've also seen heartbreaking instances of teen fatalities. These photos are from three teens who died in 2022 while on the job, employed in situations that are not permitted by current law. In this past summer, 2023, we saw three more teen fatalities, one in a Wisconsin sawmill, one in a landfill in Missouri, and another in a poultry plant in Mississippi. All of these conditions are unacceptable in the 21st century US, and we know that many of you are joining the webinar today because you agree it doesn't have to be this way and are interested in how we can act quickly to strengthen and enforce our child labor laws to deter these types of abuses. We know that when oppressive forms of child labor are allowed to continue unchecked, both from our history and in the present, children's health and education are significantly harmed, and also that employers who do follow labor laws are undermined by competition from those who profit from flouting laws, and that standards decline for all US workers across the economy. So as many of you know, EPI has devoted some significant attention to child labor this year. In 2022, we became aware of a couple of state legislative bills related to child labor cropping up. Then at the start of 2023, additional and often more extreme pieces of legislation were drawing the attention of many of our state partners in the EARN network. This was not an issue we planned or expected to work on this year, but the more we dug, the more we found. And it became very clear that this was an issue that demanded more intense state and federal attention. So I'm going to ask my colleague to share some of the research and reports that EPI has published this year in the chat so that folks can take a look at those that are of interest. That has been one piece of our work. We've also spoken to many reporters to educate them on these issues. We have worked closely with partners in our EARN network across the country who are often this year serving as the early warning system, sounding the alarm and speaking out about threats to state standards. Looking ahead to 2024, we anticipate increasing our work on state child labor policy in partnership with many of the groups in our network. So I'm very glad now to hand things over to my colleague, EPI State Policy Analyst Nina Mast, to give a brief overview of the state legislative landscape as we currently understand it, and to summarize some of the major state legislative developments from the past year. I'm going to turn it to you, Nina.
Thanks, Jen. So amid the increase in child labor violations that Jen highlighted, we know of at least 16 states that have introduced bills to roll back child labor protections in just the past 2 years, and 6 have enacted them, 3 in 2023 alone. So on the map, you can see that states that enacted child labor rollback bills are in red, and states that proposed but did not pass or did not enact bills are in pink. And these changes include lifting restrictions on hazardous work, extending the number of hours per day or per week that employers can schedule youth to work, eliminating work permit requirements that facilitate compliance with child labor laws, as well as introducing sub-minimum wages for young people based on their age or their occupation. And I think it's important to note that these bills are not confined to Republican majority states. In fact, in 2022, New Jersey, New Hampshire, and Michigan all enacted legislation that weakened child labor protections, and bills were introduced in Maine and Minnesota this year. So if we look at the bills that were enacted just in 2023, that's the next slide, Jen. There were 3 bills enacted this year. First, in Tennessee, a bill lowered the age from 18 to 16 for youth to work in establishments where more than 25% of revenue comes from alcohol sales. And this may seem like an anomaly, but it actually follows a trend in numerous states over the past few years to lower the age for work in the presence of alcohol. And not all of those bills were covered on the map I just showed, but we have a whole blog post dedicated to this particular issue. Then we have the Arkansas bill that eliminated work permits for children under the age of 16. And that work permit really notified a parent or guardian of a child's rights in the workplace, and it created a paper trail of a young worker's age and employment. And these work permits are really the focus of the Foundation for Government Accountability, which I'll discuss more in a bit. And then we have the Iowa bill, which I'm sure some are familiar with because it was particularly egregious. This made numerous changes to state law, and we have a blog post on this as well. But in short, it now allows employers to hire teens as young as 14 for previously prohibited work in laundries and light assembly. It allows state agencies to waive restrictions on a long list of hazardous jobs for 16-year-olds. It extends hours during the school year. It lowers the age to serve alcohol. It eliminates work permits, and it limits the state agency's ability to impose penalties for violations. So those are just the bills that passed this year. I want to spend a little time talking about how these bills are not being introduced in isolation. This is a very coordinated effort being led by a constellation of business lobbying groups and industry associations that especially benefit to changes in child labor laws. So this includes Non-Union Construction Association, state affiliates of the National Restaurant Association, and other low-wage employers that employ a large share of youth. And then you have right-wing think tanks and advocacy groups like the Koch-backed American for Prosperity and the Florida-based right-wing think tank, Foundation for Government Accountability, and its lobbying arm, the Opportunity Solutions Project. These groups have a broader agenda of public sector privatization and broader deregulation of the economy that extends beyond just the space of child labor. FGA, for its part, drafted the legislation that eventually passed in Arkansas, as well as a bill in Missouri. They also lobbied in support of the Iowa bill and wrote the new bill in Florida that would allow employers to schedule 16 and 17-year-olds for unlimited hours of work during the school year. But FGA's agenda is actually much bigger than child labor. While FGA lobbies for the erosion of child labor protections in these states, they're simultaneously working to impose work requirements for anti-poverty programs, block Medicaid expansion, weaken state unemployment insurance benefits, and promote the defunding of public education through the expansion of school vouchers. So this is really a multi-layered assault on the same low-income families whose children are most vulnerable to recruitment by unscrupulous employers for jobs involving long hours, low wages, and hazardous conditions that harm their health and well-being. And the work of these groups really threatens to undo the progress we've made on access to public education and basic social protections that benefit everyone. But in the face of these many troubling developments, we have seen some encouraging signs. So I want to highlight some bills introduced both at the federal and state level to strengthen child labor protections. I'll focus more on the state bills because those are what we've been focused on tracking. In 2022 and 2023, we've seen 7 states introduce positive bills to strengthen child labor protections, and 4 of those states have actually enacted those laws. So these bills increase penalties for violations of the law. They allow victims to sue in the case of injury on the job, educate youth on their rights. In the case of California, they protect child influencers from exploitation in the case of Illinois. And there is an effort to ban child labor in tobacco in Virginia, which was not introduced this year, but has been introduced in the past. So that's all to say there is lots of room in every state for lawmakers to develop proactive bills to strengthen child labor protections. And while federal reforms are still needed, and many federal bills have already been introduced this year, states can enact their own changes without an act of Congress. So we really want to see more proposals like this, especially bills that address longstanding disparities in child labor protections and bills that protect youth in hazardous industries. So I hope that provides some background on the current child labor landscape. Now I'll hand it back to Jen to introduce our panelists, who will dig deeper into how we got into this mess and what we can do about it.
Thanks so much, Nina. And as we continue, I want to make sure folks know that we do have time allotted for some discussion at the end, and are very willing to, all of your panelists are very willing to take your questions. You can type them into the Q&A box as we're going, or save them for the end. I'm going to turn it over to David Weil now. So excited to have him here. David is professor at the Heller School for Social Policy and Management at Brandeis University and a visiting senior fellow at the Ash Center for Democracy at the Harvard Kennedy School. Weil served previously as administrator of the Wage and Hour Division of the U.S. Department of Labor under President Barack Obama from 2014 to January 2017. He is an absolute internationally recognized expert in employment and labor market policy, regulation, transparency policy, and the impacts of industry restructuring on wages, employment, and work. And is the author of more than hundreds of articles and 5 books, including The Fissured Workplace, which is one of our top recommendations that we have been sharing with folks on this issue all year. So I think we're also going to share the link to that book so that people know how to find it. So highly relevant. And David, please take it away. We are thrilled to have you here and eager to hear from you.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. I really appreciate the invitation to participate. Thanks to EPI and EARN for sponsoring this important webinar. I want to take my time really to lay out in some detail the overall context that I think is driving a lot of the child labor violations we're seeing across the country, and key up the need the decisive need for understanding these kinds of forces so we can take systemic approaches to proactively fighting child labor and fighting the outbreak that we're seeing. Systemic approaches to enforcement of existing laws, setting aside the need, as Nina just described, for new laws, is absolutely critical in addressing these kinds of problems. Not only because these problems often stem from common causes that are leading employers to violate, but also because of the long-term underfunding of our key enforcement agencies at the federal level, and that being the Wage and Hour Division and the Solicitor's Office, and comparably under-resourcing at the state level that I know my colleague and friend Terry Gerstein is going to be talking about. So I want to go to the forces that are driving what we're seeing, and then talk briefly about some of the categories of solutions I think that require us to look at. I hope you're all seeing my slide here. And why are we seeing child labor again? I mean, we have had ongoing and real problems with child labor in industries like retail, food, service, and certainly, as Norma Flores Lopez is going to talk about, in agriculture. But in recent years, we have seen child labor recurring in some of the industries that Jennifer described in her opening remarks, in industries like the auto industry, where we found children as young as 14 working, in the poultry and meat processing industries, where children have been actually found working on the kill floors of major meat processors, and in packaged food industries that provide very familiar products like Fritos, Quaker Oats, and General Mills products. And these are children working not only in industries where they are prohibited from being present, but actually doing work with dangerous machinery, chemicals, and exposing themselves to harm and in the worst cases, fatalities. So what's going on here? Well, what's going on here, sadly, is related to something I have been studying for many, many years. And it's the fissuring of work. It is the ongoing breaking apart of the way business is organized in order to find lower cost ways of producing all kinds of goods and services. And at the same time, major companies in our economy still having a means to control the services and the product in ways that are profitable, but for the companies, but expose working people to the worst kinds of violations, and clearly child labor violations like the ones we're seeing are examples of that. Now, let me just quickly pull apart the three cases or the three types of major violations we're seeing to illustrate that. If we look at the meat processing cases, JBS Meat's a huge producer of beef, pork, and chicken products. Turkey Valley Farms, Tyson, Purdue. In all of those cases, and in particular the JBS Turkey Valley and Tyson case, investigation by the Wage and Hour Division and litigation by the Solicitor's Office found a common feature to those well-known brands, all using a common, very large contractor, PSSI, to do cleaning on the kill floors of their facilities. PSSI, in turn, owned by private equity, found those children through local labor brokers housed all over the country. And so PSSI was a conduit to bring these workers into the very hazardous conditions that we saw in all of these cases. Now, one of the reasons we have so many children that are potentially vulnerable is we have had, partly due to the failure of our immigration policies, a large number of unaccompanied minors in our country who are awaiting asylum protection. But unfortunately, those children don't have the kinds of economic protections that they need to allow them to sustain themselves during the period of time they're waiting asylum processing. As a result, because of their own economic vulnerability and because of the fact they're often here, no family sends a child to another country unaccompanied unless they're in economic desperation. Those children needing to send resources home to their families give rise to a large pool of workers. The fissuring structure that I've described here allows the supply of workers to be brought into major manufacturers like JBS Foods or Purdue and Tyson and end up on the floor. This is not a unique case. If we look at the incidents or the finding of multiple children working in Hyundai suppliers, it's a similar kind of setup where Hyundai, obviously a very well-known brand, worked through a series of suppliers in the South, one that was wholly owned, two other separate companies that are sole suppliers of Hyundai, to do pieces of production. And where did the workforce come from for those companies? It came from, again, a series of local staffing agencies that brought them from their own communities into these facilities. And finally, if we take the case of Frito-Lay, General Mills, Quaker Oats, producers of products we all use every morning, all day, and imagine as sort of being produced in compliance with our laws. Once again, a key intermediary, in this case, a company called Heartside, which provides package manufacturing for all these companies, sometimes in facilities where they're producing multiple products for those same brands. Again, drew on a series of local staffing agencies, small brokers, labor contractors to bring those children into these facilities. And this common structure, not surprisingly, leads to a very common claim on the part of the producers whose names we know. And that is when they are cited, when the Department of Labor has brought these cases forward, they uniformly say, we're shocked there's child labor. And I think that speaks to the problem we need to address through proactive enforcement as systemic problems that devolve from a form of business organization. We need to use our laws in a strategic way that makes sure we assign responsibility not to the low-level contractors that are the immediate perpetrators of child labor violations, but upward in the chain. We can do that through the kinds of laws that we have, even before we reform them, but it requires resources, it requires strategic enforcement, and it's the kind of actions we've seen the Labor Department engaging in many of these cases, including, I would point you to, as I finish up, the exclusive Poultry Incorporated case that's just been brought by the Labor Department that uses the full range of remedies available to the Wage and Hour Division and the Solicitor's Office to address and assign a responsibility upward in those fissured structures. That's what we need more of. That's what gives me some optimism as we face this huge problem of rampant child labor. Let me stop at that. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And we are going to transition to our next speaker while knowing that there are many questions we can come back to for more detail in the discussion, now that David's laid such an incredible groundwork for thinking through the structural problems that are at the root of some of what we're seeing. Thank you for putting the link to the exclusive poultry case in the chat as well, it looks like. And I want to turn next to Norma Flores Lopez. Very excited to have you here. Norma is chair of the Child Labor Coalition's Domestic Issues Committee at the National Consumers League, and previously has served in leadership roles at organizations including Justice for Migrant Women, the East Coast Migrant Head Start Project, and the Foundation for Farm Workers. Norma grew up as a child of migrant farm worker family from South Texas and began working in the fields at the age of 12, where she continued working through high school graduation. She has long been an active advocate for migrant farm worker children's rights and continues to raise awareness on issues affecting the farm worker community. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Jennifer, and thank you, EPI, for this invitation to be able to talk. Um, as mentioned, I grew up as a migrant farm worker. That's something that my parents did for generations. My grandparents started working in the fields and would migrate from Mexico across the border into the US, up into northern states to be able to follow the harvest. We would go up to states like Indiana, Michigan, Colorado, Ohio, Iowa, and worked in all kinds of crops from apple picking to detasseling corn, asparagus, cucumbers, onion fields. And so myself, that was something that I grew up not knowing anything different. My family and I would pack up all of our belongings to the back of a pickup truck, pile into the truck, and start our journey of 2 days. Those 2 days, were met with all kinds of challenges along the way, sometimes broken down cars, sometimes getting to work sites and being told that there was no housing available, or sometimes even no work, or that the work was going to be delayed. And we had spent all of our money just trying to be able to get there. Many families migrate across the country, and oftentimes even across international borders, to be able to uphold our food systems, to be able to do the work that cannot be replaced by robots, of making sure that we're putting food on the tables. And with that comes challenges. In the past, it used to be from Southern California up along the West Coast, another stream, from South Texas, the home of the largest community of migrant farm workers, all the way up across the country, to the states that I mentioned where my family went to, and then also along the East Coast, the corridor that starts in Florida all the way up through the Carolinas to New Jersey and to Maine. But what we've been seeing a lot over the years is that this has been disrupted, whether it's by internal immigration enforcement, by laws that are being constituted by at the state level, states that are being much more friendlier to migrant workers, states that are cracking down on it, states that are hiring much more H-2A workers, that are much more vulnerable, and can be tied to a certain worker and taken advantage of. And that seems to be preferable than to workers who could be able to pick up and move if they don't like the work conditions. And so those are a number of challenges that we've seen sort of pop up that has disrupted that system. But there are certain pieces that are still in place, in agriculture in particular. One of them is the people that are out there working in the fields that are doing a lot of the backbreaking work, 100-degree weather, 10 to 12-hour days, 7 days a week. Those are the folks that tend to be, living incredible levels of poverty, that don't have a whole lot of say, have barriers such as immigration status, language barriers. Those are all things that my family, some of them which we experienced, but some of them that we were very fortunate not to have to deal with. As I mentioned, my parents did this, but my parents were actually US born. They were born in the United States, but they were pulled out of school in the 3rd grade and in the 6th grade. And they were sent out to go work because their family was in desperate poverty. And so then when they had their family, their children, we came along with my parents. As many parents know, child care is so expensive and hard to come by, and especially in rural communities where there's very limited options. If there wasn't a Head Start program, in which I was fortunate enough to be able to be enrolled in, then my family would need to find somebody that could accommodate the long hours of working in the fields, those really early in the hours up until nighttime. And that was very difficult and very expensive for them. So what happened is that although I was officially working at age 12, as mentioned in my bio, which is what is legal in the US, I was working unofficially at 9 years old, by my parents' side. That was what they knew. That's what they felt was the safest. They'd rather have us with them instead of left alone in housing that was shared with other migrant workers, and they didn't know who was there, or to leave us home alone. And as I mentioned, it was very limited options, and we could be able to help contribute to the larger income that my family desperately needed. As many folks who have studied agriculture or know anything about work in agriculture, a very popular system that is employed by workers is the piece rate, in which the employer will pay one individual based on how much they're harvesting. And so for families, it allows to be able to hide a lot of violations that happen. And that's already coupled with the fact that you know, in agriculture, there's very little enforcement. As much as the laws you could change and you could be able to activate them if the workers don't know about them because they're in decentralized locations, if the workers don't know about them because they're working under a contractor or a subcontractor rather than the company themselves, if they don't have any sort of area where they could be able to congregate and see this in their language, and the fact that so many workers don't even have the ability to read or to write themselves, this all just sort of spells this just disaster for workers and their rights. And it sort of has allowed for issues like child labor to be able to breed. That's all already on top of the fact that by US law, it's already been something that's been sanctioned. Child labor is something that's written into the code, an exemption from all other child labor laws in this country, where children can work at much younger ages with less safeguards for longer hours, with very few protections. And that includes some of the most dangerous work. I was able to start working at age 12. And for most folks, working full time is 8 to 5, 40 hours a week. And most of us are pretty done at the end of that sort of week. For me, as a 12-year-old child, that meant working 10 to 12-hour days, as I mentioned, 7 days a week. Sometimes I would go 3-4 weeks without any days off during the summer. And all of that was perfectly legal for me to be out there. I had to keep up the work as any other adult. I had to push myself really hard, and sometimes much to at the detriment of my own health. Because I knew how desperately my family needed that money. And so not only was I working in one of the most dangerous industries, I mean, we're shocked to hear that there's kids working in poultry plants and some of these packaging places, but the reality is agriculture is the most dangerous industry, right up there with mining and construction. Well, luckily, we haven't been seeing kids working in mining and construction. That's been outlawed. But agriculture, again, at the age of 12, I can start working there. I could start doing dangerous work that is prohibited everywhere else at the age of 16. Work that we know that we have the science to show that can be fatal for children, and yet they're trusted with this sort of work. And so with what we're seeing here is, why is this being allowed to happen? Why did this happen to me? Is because we're talking again about some of the most vulnerable workers. These companies that have been taken over like to hide behind these family farm exemptions, like to hide behind this agrarian idyllic sort of views and the red barns and blue skies that we see when we're shopping in the grocery store, when the reality is much harsher when you're out there in the fields. All you have to do is drive a few miles outside of these major cities and go into the rural communities, and you will see the housing that is shared by workers that's dilapidated, that's dangerous. We lived in housing that was converted chicken coops, and this was in the 2000s. When I was growing up working in the fields, I would have to go to the bathroom in outhouses. I would have shared showers, and I was like any other kid. I knew that this was something that's totally outside, but we knew also how desperately my family needed this. And so when I had abusive bosses that would yell at me and curse me out and call me every name under the sun every single day, I knew also to keep my mouth shut, because I knew how important it was for my parents to be able to get that money. And so it again, this is something that contributes to the detriment of children. As somebody that had to go through school, I would often every year have to transfer to 2-3 different schools every year as we migrated, every single time starting a whole new system, because each state has their own system, has their own curriculum, and having to always be playing behind. It's easy to see why children who work in agriculture are dropping out at 4 times the national rate. And so again, for people that want to talk about how this is a vocational training, how this is something to be able to help us, I saw that it was quite the opposite. It was actually something that was done to be able to exploit me and my family. And it's something I continue to see kids that are going through the same thing now. And among them, the most vulnerable, those kids that are unaccompanied coming across the country. And so with that, I want to urge folks to be able to help and take action. There are bills that help protect children from this, the most dangerous industry. Again, folks, as we're seeing in other industries, are taking right out, using agriculture as a blueprint on how to be able to cut down on labor expenses and really be able to maximize profits and putting profits over people. I encourage you to check out the Child Labor Coalition. And also there's another sectional group of about 30 organizations, both of domestic and international organizations that are coming together to address child labor that will be launching in January. And so there's a lot that we could be able to do to address this issue. But just know that it is absolutely imperative that everybody take action and that we push back on a lot of these, that it's not in any way built, any of these laws or bills to be able to help the children, but rather to be able to try to find those among us that can be exploited. And at the end, what ends up happening is these children are sacrificing their health, their childhood, their education, and sometimes even their lives. And with that, I turn it back.
Thank you so much. And I know we already have a couple of questions to come back to you with when we have time at the end. I am excited now to turn to Terry Gerstein. So excited to have you here, Terry. Terry's the director of the NYU Wagner Labor Initiative at NYU's Robert F. Wagner Graduate School of Public Service, and until very recently has also been a senior fellow at EPI and director of the State and Local Enforcement Project at the Harvard Law School Center for Labor and a Just Economy. Terry previously served as Labor Bureau Chief in the New York State Attorney General's Office and a Deputy Commissioner in the New York State Department of Labor. Prior to her government service, Gerstein was a nonprofit lawyer in Miami, Florida, representing immigrant workers. And Terry, it has been so valuable to have the chance to work with you on this issue all year, and very eager to give you some time to share with this broader audience. Take it away.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation to speak on this webinar and the opportunity to share some thoughts about policies to fight this really, striking and disturbing resurgence of child labor. My comments today, I'm going to focus on enforcement of the child labor laws. So I'm not going to focus on the actual content of what is protected, but I'm going to focus on enforcement and on laws and policies that would help strengthen enforcement. But first, I want to just share a few basic concepts about how child labor laws are enforced in the U.S. One is that it is all government enforcement. There's no private right of action, just like for minimum wage or discrimination cases, there's a private right of action and people can file lawsuits. That's not the case with regard to child labor. There's also no federal preemption. So what this means is the Fair Labor Standards Act, the federal law, is a floor, not a ceiling. It doesn't preempt states from passing much stronger laws if they want to, or localities from passing laws as well. Most enforcement is civil, with seeking injunctive relief, meaning changed practices, or civil monetary penalties, but there have been a handful of criminal prosecutions. And the penalties are generally modest, and there are no damages for the workers, for the children. There was a question in the chat specifically about that, about the need for remediation for rights holders, meaning are there benefits, are there some kind of redress for the children in these cases? And the answer is no. If there's enforcement, they end up, losing the job that they have, but it's not like a minimum wage or overtime case where there's a back wage award to the minors. And the federal penalties, the maximum penalties in the 15,000 range, and state penalties vary, but are typically far, far lower, often in the three figures. And some of them are even you could pay with a couple $20 bills. I won't go into much detail about this because David has already spoken about it, as well as there's resources in the chat that have been shared. But the resources to enforce child labor laws are grossly insufficient. One point that I would note is that generally the agencies, both at the federal and state level, that enforce child labor laws do not enforce only those laws. They also enforce minimum wage laws and overtime and Family and Medical Leave Act and prevailing wage and a host of other laws. And so they really, really are public sector agencies that are supposed to be enforcing workers' rights laws and protecting people's rights at work, have really been starved for decades and are greatly they're just in need of a lot more resources to do the job that they need to do. So there's in terms of employer compliance, Ashenfelter and Smith, who are economists, came up with this formula that employers won't comply with the law if the expected penalties are too small, either because it's easy to escape detection or because the penalties are too small. So in plain language, the way that I understand this, which is sort of common sense, is that the likelihood of an employer complying is a function of the likelihood of detection and how severe the consequences will be if they're caught. And as we talk about this and what policies would help, that should sort of be our North Star, right? What is going to deter violations, not just like address them after they've happened, but increasing the likelihood that employers are going to change conduct. So the first one, which I've labeled Captain Obvious, is funding for enforcement and increasing the penalties. There are proposals to increase penalties at in some states. But I do want to note that increasing the penalties alone is not enough, because if the likelihood, if we think of that formula, if the likelihood of detection is still very, very slim, or the likelihood of experiencing those penalties is very slim, even if the penalties are astronomical, it's more theoretical and not likely to change conduct. David spoke extensively about the fissured workplace. And the fact that lead corporations or household names are often able to avoid responsibility for violations in their supply chains through using subcontractors and staffing agencies and the fissured model. As he noted, they'll often say, like, we had no idea this was going on, but they really have the ability to prevent these violations through vetting before they subcontract, through monitoring their subcontractors, through making it clear they'll end a subcontract if this is found. They can take the jobs in-house, as JBS did with some janitorial jobs after Packer sanitation came to light. So they really have the ability to address these violations and know about them. So it really does make sense for them to be held responsible. And certainly if they say, we had no idea this was going on, it's much harder for them to say that if it's a repeat violation or if there are widespread violations in their supply chain. So creating this kind of liability, joint liability by lead corporations is something that I think is very, very important. Our current law, the Fair Labor Standards Act, does allow, the definition of employee is very broad, but case law has narrowed it. And there are some state precedents of creating joint liability upchain. Procurement is another important tool. The question is whether corporations that commit egregious child labor violations should be paid for contracts with public taxpayer money. I think most of us would answer no. There's a bipartisan Senate bill that would do that. And there are some local precedents as well of wage theft ordinances that have contracting consequences. The locality won't do business with wage theft, employers that have committed wage theft. Another important tool is workers' compensation. The grand bargain of workers' compensation is that workers can't, when they're injured or killed on the job, they typically cannot file lawsuits in tort for damages, like personal injury lawsuits, and instead they get the certainty and relative swiftness of workers' compensation insurance. But there's a question of whether that is actually appropriate here. And there are some states that when minors are killed or injured on the job, if the employer was violating child labor laws and their employment was in violation of the law, some states allow the minor or the representative to file a personal injury tort lawsuit for damages. And this has the potential to change employer conduct, because the worst case scenario, if the only remedy is workers' comp, is a slight increase in the workers' comp premium. But the worst case scenario, if there is the potential of a tort lawsuit, is really much, much greater. Colorado passed a law to this effect last legislative session, and a few other states have laws like that as well. Stop work orders allow the government to basically say the Department of Labor to stop work at a given workplace. New Jersey has this, for example, with regard to wage theft. And a couple of months ago, they issued stop work orders to a number of Boston Market locations and recovered $600,000 and very swift compliance in less than a month. Massachusetts has a bill to this effect in relation to wage theft that would also require the employer to pay wages for the first 10 days that the work is stopped. The hot goods provision is a provision at the federal level that allows the Department of Labor to get an injunction preventing the shipping of goods that have been made in violation of child labor laws. States could pass similar laws at the state level. There's also a tool of advising consumers about violations, because consumers do really care about this and it shocks the conscience. We had a law in New York State where I enforced laws for many years involving the garment industry, where we could place a tag that you can see here on the screen. We could place a tag when garments were manufactured in violation of the wage and hour laws, advising consumers that this garment was unlawfully manufactured. Publicity is another important tool that can deter violations. I'll flag that New Jersey recently passed a wall of shame law where they list some particularly egregious employers on the website. There are several other states that have online databases of violations. Work permits, as we heard about before, are really important as educational tools for employers and for children and parents to know what the laws are. This is an example of a work permit form from Washington State, but many are similar, and they often include information about the child labor laws, so they really serve an educational purpose. Mandating workers' rights education. This is a really exciting law that just passed in California, designating a certain week, Workplace Rights Education Week, and requiring high school students to be educated about child labor, wage and hour, workplace safety, and other basic rights. This is valuable for minors and also for adult workers, because tons and tons of research shows that many adults don't know their rights at work. Additional measures that would be valuable: expanding the pool of enforcers, so it's not just the government, so like having a private right of action, so minors could file, or the representatives could file a lawsuit. A whistleblower right of action. In some of these cases, there were coworkers who saw what was happening but didn't have an avenue for taking action. Also, creating redress for violations and addressing the minors' needs. So as we talked about before, and someone mentioned in Q&A, having some kind of damages for minors who've been victims of the violations. And although not all child labor, victims of child labor are immigrants, the ones who are often have needs in regard to that, and enabling them, for example, to get work authorization would help them get above board jobs with law-abiding employers who are not violating the laws. These kinds of provisions can also help overcome the obstacles to minors reporting violations. I'll just share in 60 seconds some quick thoughts on enforcement. One is child labor enforcement is extremely resource intensive. It requires pre-planning, search warrants, sometimes talking to school officials, going on site at all odd hours of the day, talking to minors who may be afraid of talking to the investigators, a lot of work after the fact, collaboration with community organizations, really highly skilled investigators as well, who have the language and cultural competency skills. So this is not simple work. This is very resource and labor intensive. And then my final thought on enforcement is that while the federal labor department and state labor department labor departments are obviously the key leaders in this area, there are a lot of other potential government actors who can play a part in this. They're listed on the screen. I think it's worthwhile noting that getting this on the radar of a range of people like building and health inspectors and school officials, and again, creating vehicles for them to report violations or concerns, is something that could be very valuable. And my final thought is just that, this is a situation where we really have some shared values on this. I think everyone wants kids to have a good experience in their first job and wants children to be safe. And there are several bipartisan proposals in the Senate on this. So I do think there's some reason for hope for action on these issues at the federal level and at the state level. And there is really a lot of potential for action to help stem the tide of this really terrible trend. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And it's great that you wrapped up on the message that there are roles for almost everyone to play in tackling this problem. And I can tell from the many questions that are cropping up already that we've got dozens and dozens of folks joining us today who are already thinking about many of the roles that they can play and are playing. I will start by answering the very easy question so that I don't forget before the end, but just to reiterate that yes, the the recording of this webinar and the links that have been shared in the chat will be emailed to everybody who's registered. The recording will also be available on the EPA website after the event. And going somewhat in order, I just want to jump back to some of the questions that have come up as the three of you were sharing your terrific presentations. One is very specific, and a couple people I think were curious. Norma, if you could just go back and say a little bit more about H-2A workers and why they experience a higher level of vulnerability.
Absolutely. Very briefly, H-2A workers are guest workers that are brought into the U.S. From other countries. Primarily, we see a lot of them in agriculture coming in from Mexico or Central America. These workers oftentimes are illegally recruited with coming over into the U.S. already having debt. Recruiters are not supposed to charge for that, for helping in that process, but oftentimes we learn that they do. And so they're already in debt. They are tied to the specific employer that applied for these H-2A workers, so they do not have the right to be able to pick up and go. And we've heard of cases where these employers will take away their passports, for example, or will physically abuse them. They are isolated. They cannot bring their families with them. And they are not able to access a lot of the same rights that other workers are able to. And they cannot stay in the US no matter how many years they come. It doesn't get them any closer to any immigration status or rights. They will never be able to vote, et cetera. And so it makes them particularly vulnerable. H-2A is a classification specifically for agricultural workers. There's other types of guest workers like H-2B and other folks like that. But the ones I was mentioning, because I was talking about child labor and agriculture, are those in the fields. And that already comes with the top of, migrant workers, Spanish speakers, people working in rural America, all the challenges that come already from them.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to keep tossing out questions and look to all of you for some quick answers so that we can at least get through several. I know we won't get through them all, but I think we can cover a lot of ground. This is really a question potentially for all of you, but the rise in child labor has drawn some overdue, really important attention to the longstanding, persistent gaps and the exemptions for agriculture and domestic work under both the National Labor Relations Act and the Fair Labor Standards Act. How would covering these occupations under those federal laws help address child labor and maybe some of the other root problems that we've talked about today?
Well, I think it is an aberration that we have left agriculture out of our basic child labor protections, and clearly under the Fair Labor Standards Act, just including them under the overall umbrella would have an enormous impact on our ability to enforce the law, as we do in other areas, setting aside the issues of resource constraint. It's unfortunate that very powerful lobbies have precluded any kind of broader inclusion of agriculture in our federal laws. There has been some advances at the state level, and for the reasons that Terry talked about, but it has been a huge roadblock for decades under federal law.
We know that unionized workers have benefits, have stronger protections, have folks to be able to help support them, have higher wages, have a stronger voice with the employer. And so keeping agricultural workers away from any of those sort of benefits, including higher pay. We know also that around the world, and including here in the US, one of the biggest drivers of child labor is poverty. I was out there because my parents couldn't afford to put food on the table, not because they wanted that life for me and didn't have much of a choice in the matter. And so if we're able to give them access to these sort of benefits and protections that would allow them to be able to get higher pay, a fair living wage, then we would see a decrease in child labor. There is no substitute for that. All the enforcement in the world and everything else that we've been talking about would not be able to be a good substitute for being able to pay workers a higher wage, and unions have proven to be a great conduit for that. And so it would absolutely benefit all low-wage workers, and especially those that have been exempt, such as domestic workers and agricultural workers that also tend to be some of the most vulnerable.
Yeah, thank you. And to toss the next one toward Terry, we have had several questions about enforcement crop up, and I appreciate you've answered some of them already. one very specific question is about the increasing penalties, and is it useful to set both a ceiling and a floor on civil monetary penalties? And I'm going to just combine a couple here, because a related question about increasing penalties, and I know a question that crops up for a lot of our state advocates, is as we're passing stronger regulations, is there a current concern about how do you respond to concerns about unintentionally harming child workers? You addressed this a little bit already in your presentation, so I'll toss those two combined to you.
So the first question about unintentionally harming child workers, there was a question in the Q&A about some minors need to work in order to earn money. And I think that one important point to note at the outset is that our child labor laws do allow minors who are 14 and over to work in a wide range of jobs. The only thing the child labor laws prohibit is having children work in excessively dangerous jobs that were particularly selected because they're the highest rate of injury or death for adults, and even worse for minors. And they prohibit having minors work hours that are so excessive or shifts that are so poorly timed that they interfere with kids' ability to get an education. So that's something I think is important to note. The question about penalties, I mean, I think, again, it is a question of what is a penalty that is going to be a sufficient level that is going to be more than the cost of doing business for an employer. And I think that, should there be minimum penalties as, in addition to maximum penalties? I mean, I think that can be a helpful tool. And having, the U.S. Department of Labor just put out guidelines about how they're going to calculate the civil monetary penalties and different factors that will mitigate or aggravate the penalties. But again, I think that too much focus on penalties alone is a little bit misguided, because really, again, if you have a fissured workplace situation and the only entity that's going to experience those penalties is the staffing agency or the subcontractor, and the lead corporation that really could have prevented this in the first place and kind of knew it was going on widespread in their supply chain, if they are off the hook, I don't think those penalties are really going to do the long-term kind of prevention that we really need in this situation.
Yeah, thank you. I am going to combine a couple more questions which get at the bigger picture, and we're going to take only a short answer. But I think it is right to kind of zoom out as we're our time for today is coming to an end, and as we're transitioning to looking ahead, because this is part of a much bigger picture, as all of you have pointed. So, one question that's in the chat, and it's cropped up as a theme in several questions, is, in addition to looking at child labor law as one specific area that is where we have many opportunities for improvement and reform, what are folks' thoughts about more broadly what we can do to tackle child and family poverty? And also, the reality that what we are often seeing in terms of the trends on state legislation is that the same organizations and groups that are pushing to weaken child labor standards are doing so as part of a package of state legislation that is unfortunately increasing the poverty or the economic desperation of children and families. So I will toss that out to any of you who have thoughts to share to wrap us up.
Well, I would quickly, just picking up on the last part of what you said, Jennifer. Powerful interests have always shaped the response or the barriers to responses to the kinds of problems like child labor, or more generally child poverty. They're concerted pressures. They're often very much focused on the economic interests of very powerful small groups of people in the financial and business sectors. And I think we see that playing out in this case, and the rapid spreading of these efforts to relax state level violations. I think we have to just always be cognizant of that underpinning of both negative legislation and therefore the need for much more systemic responses, as I think all three of us have described on this panel.
I think it goes back to allowing, to build off of what David just shared, allowing for companies to be able to prevail and for profits to matter more than people. There's a huge effort, in addition to all of these attacks on regulations, to dehumanize folks, to be able to other them. And we see this constantly through the media of the bombardment and the attacks on the immigrant communities, and folks that are trying to be able to cross into the US and to vilify them and act like they are the problem and they are the reason why there's so many issues here in the US, including poverty. And so I think that as long as we continue to vilify and dehumanize folks, we're going to continue to see these sort of issues, because there will always be poverty and an underclass to be able to take advantage of. And I continue to push on this issue of the great irony in the US, where the very folks that harvest our fruits and vegetables are the ones that can't afford them. And I think that there's a lot in just that particular example that can be able to show all of the systemic breakdowns that we have, whether it's the cost of food, how it gets to our table, the rights of workers, et cetera, all of those sort of wrapped into that. Again, as I shared earlier, we absolutely need to push for a fair living wage. We need to be able to do a lot to address poverty in this country, or else we'll continue to see this generational cycle of poverty, especially for migrant workers, farm workers that are on the fields, low wage workers. For me, I saw a question come through about how did I escape education? I was able to go on and got an opportunity to get an education, to get my master's degree, to be able to work and achieve my goals and dreams. But that would not have been possible if it wasn't for great sacrifices from my parents, and me getting really, really lucky, because there's a lot of people that were left in the fields that continue to work there and are passing on this to their children as well, and continue to be trapped in this.
I have just a couple of very quick thoughts about this. One is just that we really need to have a robust, healthy, well-funded public sector in all kinds of ways. And, not just in terms of enforcement, but in terms of affordable education, in terms of, a safety net and public benefit system. And the whole kind of 1980s, the government's the bad guy is just, we really, really need to move beyond that, because we need a healthy public sector. And then the final answer, which, is obvious to anyone who follows EPI, is just we need to make it easier for workers to join unions. And, when people are unionized, unions reduce economic inequality, they increase people's wages and benefits. When an industry is unionized, it raises the standards in, not only among unionized employers, but within the industry as a whole. EPI has a bazillion charts on this about how, as unionization rates went down, economic inequality increased. And so, I think that is also a really critical part of the equation.
Well, thank you all again. The questions that are lingering in the chat are those that we are going to continue delving in, and we encourage folks to stay in touch for more. So I want to wrap up by thanking again our EPI communications team, my EARN colleagues, and our outstanding guest speakers for their ongoing work and leadership, and for everybody who took time today to share so many examples and powerful ideas for building on this work. The attendees who joined us, for all your questions and the ideas you added to today's session, which are giving us a really powerful glimpse of the thousands of struggles that advocates and workers are engaged in right now across the country to combat these kind of employer abuses of power and to seek justice for workers and children. Everyone who attended, again, will receive a follow-up email with the recording and the link that we shared today. And on behalf of EPI and our EARN network, thank you again for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you next time and staying in touch in between. Take care, everybody.